Hello, everyone. I threw my back out earlier this week, so I apologize if I seem uncomfortable. Thank you for joining us this evening. And if you've been listening to the podcast, thank you as well. My name is Sachin Bhola. I am the co-creator of Fashioning Identity. I am also the writer and host of the podcast, and I'm an editor at Highsnobiety. You know, I got a little nervous leading up to this event, besides the back thing. And I usually am a bit with public speaking, so I asked myself why. Why do I get nervous speaking in front of people? And I realized it goes back to my days in high school when I was bullied for being gay. And so during oral presentations, I would stand up in front of my classmates, and they would laugh at me, they would call me names, they would throw things at me, and it was extremely uncomfortable, traumatizing, and I'm sure I carry some of that with me to this day. So I think about these things a lot. I think about how our identities, in this example, my sexual identity, really shapes what we go through in life. So the bad, the good, and everything in between. And when I started working at Highsnobiety, I met a woman by the name of Sonia Manalili. Sonia is the co-creator of Fashioning Identity, and she is in the audience in the beautiful jumpsuit. Hi, Sonia.
Woo!
Shout out to Sonia. She is also produces and edits the show. So if you like this show, you need to check out everything else she does because she's Highsnobiety's sole podcast producer. So Sonia is a woman of Asian origin. I am a gay man of Asian origin, of Indian origin specifically. And we bonded over conversations about identity and our struggles. And because we had both been working in fashion for a number of years, we were really interested, really passionate about how this all connected. So that's what inspired Fashioning Identity. The podcast has been doing well. It's currently in the top 50 fashion podcasts on Apple Podcasts. So thank you for listening. So the first episode examined gender, and that was followed by an episode on the LGBTQIA+ community, followed by an episode on race, and most recently disabilities. And this evening, we have invited a guest from each of those episodes to talk about all of this and also to explore how each of these layers intersect with one another, which is really cool because we don't really do that on the podcast. The podcast focuses on one subject and then deep dives into it. But the reality is many of us have intersectional identities, right? So for example, I'm not just a cis gay man, I'm a cis gay Indian man. And what does that mean? And what does fashion have to do with that? So we're gonna get into all of that with the help of our panelists. So panelists, welcome. I'm gonna have you very quickly introduce yourself so we can jump into the conversation, but you will also find their bios in the programming that was distributed. And if you have any questions, please hold on to them because we will have a Q&A at the end of this discussion. So first we have Jody Paterson. Jody, it's good to see you again.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
I feel like our volume is so low. Is everyone, can you hear us? Oh, good. Okay. You have a great voice.
Oh.
I'm Jody Paterson. I'm an author and a social activist. I deal mostly in gender variance and the discussion around trans realities and trans needs. I'm a mother of 5, and my third child is transgender, which brought me out of fashion, out of beauty, out of all the industries that I had worked in previously, and required me to deep dive into gender and identity in ways that I hadn't thought of before. Growing up in the 70s in New York City, I was mostly thinking of race. And so now I, as an author and as a public speaker and a social activist, I sit on the board of the Human Rights Campaign, our largest LGBT organization. I'm the chairman of the board, and I work both on the political side, trying to change legislature, and also on the hearts and minds side, trying to open up our ideas around all the confines: race, gender, identity, sexual orientation.
Thank you. And next we have Nora Tagouri. Welcome.
Thanks for sharing all of that. And thank you for starting the conversation with such a vulnerable story. I felt that, I appreciated that that was like very, very courageous of you. So thank you. My name is Noor Tagouri. I am a journalist, producer, speaker. I focus on documentary series that highlight spectrums of issues in America and also subcommunities in America. And I travel around the world talking about how to break barriers through storytelling and how to build community through our stories.
Thank you. And next we have Ash Owens.
Wow, I mean, following that introduction, just all of you guys are so incredible at speaking, and I think it's such an honor to be up here. And my background is kind of layered in a lot of different parts of these things, where I kind of came into fashion, but previously studying political science, and then getting into fashion. I kind of grew up in like, was cast as a model like very young, at like 15 or something like that, and so my experience from fashion was in a very like insecure, walking into these like shoots, and you don't even know what's going on, and you've got all this pressure, and your agent is like, stop eating, and you're all this stuff, and I was like, this is not for me, And so I got into political science because in my mind I wanted to grow up to wear a suit, and I was like, how do I wear a suit? Okay, I could be a lawyer, And so I kind of came into it from this perspective of just like, people kept kind of pushing me in that way. Like all these doors kept opening up to study fashion design, and then I studied at Parsons, and then I got into the world of design through that, and kind of have had this very like unraveling experience within fashion, and it's come from this love of making a garment and seeing a dream come and all of these things, and then I'm very interested in politics, and then I'm very interested in history, and then you realize all of these things as you kind of study all those things, and how they collide, and how that's kind of created the world in which we live and what we think about fashion. So from there, I kind of left designing and started it was a editorial platform, also known as a blog. It was like, it was one of those things where I was starting all of these stories because I was getting into styling from fashion design, and I was just putting them online with friends, and we called it Grandpa Style because that was my nickname at the time. I would wear a hat and suits and all these things. And so it just kind of like caught on that became my nickname, and but the tagline was quality over quantity, and we were talking about fashion and slow fashion and inclusion and gender and sustainability, diversity. And then I was like, wait, I want this to live a lot longer than something that's kind of like cheeky and made from, kind of this perspective of like a younger perspective of myself. And so my team and I started Suited Magazine, and then we kind of evolved that into a platform of how to talk about sustainable mindset, or sustainable thought leadership, essentially. So authenticity, diversity, inclusion. And so that's been about 5 years that we've been doing that. And a lot of that has been made out of this space. So it's kind of this meta thing.
It's like a full circle moment.
It's a full circle moment, also because we've known each other for a long time. And I was married to a man at the time, and it took a really long time for me to come out of the closet. I was like 30. I was in the middle of a lot of, like, Complex was emailing me about like being interviewed for their Valentine's special with my ex at the same time that I was coming out, and there was a lot of all these things, and so I had to kind of like go back into all of that identity, and so it's been interesting. But now I'm getting back into tailoring and suit making, and so that's where I'm at, suited and suits.
It's awesome, and we're going to get into all of that.
Yeah. Sorry, I like talk.
No. And so want to make sure that we have time. Bradley.
Thanks.
Bradley
my name is
Carbone.
Bradley Carbone. I work with a company called Sneeze, which is a magazine, and it's also a consulting company. We do a lot of work kind of connecting small brands to big brands and big brands back to small brands. I came up in New York in editorial. I worked for Complex magazine for a long time, worked on the brand side and worked on the agency side. Kind of came up in a different way. I came up as like a straight, white, everything was kind of hooked up for me guy in the industry. About 5 years ago, I broke my neck snowboarding, which has kind of created a shift for me. It's had me to kind of like reconsider my position in the industry, how things work, and how I behave within this environment. So it's interesting to hear all of your stories, and excited to speak with each of you.
Yeah, and we're going to explore those stories further. So my first set of questions has to do with a past and present read on fashion and inclusivity. So this is for all of you. It's really only recently that we've seen the fashion industry making more of an effort to be inclusive of diverse identities. And by recently, I mean like the last 2 or 3 years, right? Why do you think the fashion industry has been able to get away with the lack of inclusion for so long?
I'll start.
Go for it.
I think the fashion industry has been able to get away with the lack of inclusion for so long, similar to a lot of industries, because they were able to control their own narrative without the amplification of voices of people who wanted to share their concerns. And because at the end of the day, the people who were making the decisions in fashion looked a very specific type of way, had a very specific type of identity, and the idea of becoming more diverse, let alone really inclusive of everyone, didn't really have to come up because there wasn't social media. Like, I think Instagram specifically played a huge role in it, people being able to build their own platforms to be more proud of their own identity. I mean, like, growing up, for me, looking through magazines, watching television shows, like, I didn't see people who I never saw myself represented. So, and I remember thinking, like, if I didn't see myself represented in these spaces, that meant these spaces were never meant for me. I also thought that you had to look a type of way, act a type of way, be a type of way to fit into those spaces because of the way that fashion and media defined what it meant or what you needed to look like or act like to be in those places. But now with social media and people's voices being amplified for the first time the way they are now, we can just talk back and be like, well, if you don't see me, then I don't need to spend my dollars here. Or if you don't value me, I don't need to spend my dollars here. And so many people are starting their own businesses, building their own brands, and realizing that because we have access to the entire world and we are more connected than we ever have been, even if it doesn't always feel like it, that we can build on our own and we don't always need those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Something that we were talking about kind of before we came out here, fashion is kind of split, right? There's kind of this small group of people at the top that recognizes the industry as a creative pursuit. People really appreciating it as a type of art, as a niche type of thing. The reality is fashion is the production of clothes, and it's a huge business, right? And so for so long, it's a money-based thing. It's a business like anything else, right? So the people that were owning kind of the factories, the means of production, had a very kind of specific view on who was buying the products, and so they dominated that. So as you were saying, there's really not this visibility into kind of more niche cultures. But now as people can see that and can access things that fit their specific point of view, it's starting to adjust kind of the way the companies are responding and what they're making.
I was just going to say I don't follow fashion very astutely, but from my perspective, I think that it's sort of we've conflated curation and exclusivity, and so I think for a long time we've thought that when things are exclusive, when spaces are private, membership based, when sorry guys, when there's a sense of like othering, right? And we see that in design, we see that in spaces, we see that in politics, right? So the idea of othering folks, and that sort of has been known to be exclusive, we thought was curated, a higher sense of curation. But it's an old idea. It's failed us. And so I think we'll see in fashion and in politics and in the way we raise our families and the way we structure our businesses, that othering does not work, and we need a wider sense of we. So every time we've thought of I, we now must think of we, and I think we'll see that in fashion, because fashion, yes, it is clothing and production of clothing. It's an extension of our politics, of our thought, and of our lifestyle. So yeah, I think that the idea of exclusivity is tired.
Yeah, and so I want to pick up on what you said, Nora, and tied into what you're saying. The thing about social media is that it's now allowed us to hold industries and individuals accountable, right? I know we talk a lot about call-out culture, but that is really the difference. And it's so much so that companies, whether it's a magazine or a modeling agency or a designer, we're holding them accountable, right? So now that we are starting to see a little bit of more diversity of identities included, how sincere is it? Like, is it because they're just reacting to the call-out culture and they can't ignore it? Is this just the flavor of the year? Or is it really a sincere change that's happening? What do you think?
There are so many layers to that question, because call-out culture and cancel culture is something that exists heavily, especially in the fashion space. I'm not particularly a fan of it to an extent. I understand like that there is a need sometimes, especially there's definitely a need sometimes where we need to be aware of like the way things are being done, but there is also a way to be building bridges. And I think it can be both. So I don't think that it's a trend, but it's trending right now. But I do think it's here to stay because of the reaction to it, because of the response to it. Take, for example, 2 nights ago, Fenty's fashion show, which is essentially like the replacement of the Victoria's Secret show. And that's how it's being presented. And the reaction to that, even though everybody's phones were taped and taped up or whatever, and even though we haven't even watched it yet, the buzz that was created behind it, the fact that like it was deeply inclusive and it included every single body, color, sexual orientation, gender, everything you can think of. And the reaction to it is so strong. And so I think because it's, quote, trending right now, it's inevitable that everybody is seeing that you can make a profit off of this, that this is where the demand is turning to, and that you can no longer only serve one type of consumer. And if you do that, you will get left behind. However, are people doing it the right way? Are they approaching this the right way? Not everyone, and I think that is a really important conversation to have. So, for example, recently Banana Republic released a line of hijabs, of like the headscarves that Muslim women wear, right? And which is huge, it's major, because mainstream brands don't typically sell hijabs in a way that is intentionally for Muslim women. I've bought scarves from Banana Republic when I first started wearing hijab because they had summer scarves that I happened to be able to put on my head, but they were never curated. So the hijabs that I have are specifically from brands, from Muslim women-owned brands. However, when they released the line of hijabs, they released it without having consulted actual Muslim women, which is bananas to me.
So were they like too short?
So I wasn't a fan of them at all, but it got deeper than that. Like I had conversations with the team before about consulting and having those conversations and what that actually looks like. But when they had reached out and they talked to us about like this new hijab line, we asked them if they had consulted Muslim women on it, because I wouldn't personally wear those scarves. There are people I'm sure that would, and when we asked that question, the response was we gave one Muslim woman a questionnaire.
Wow.
There are over 1 billion Muslim people around the world. The modest market in itself is, I think, worth like $7 billion by 2020. Don't quote me on that, but Muslim women are spending so much money towards that. The least you can do to mitigate the risk of having a situation like what just happened, but also truly properly serving the communities that you want to serve, is to be inclusive. And inclusive means being a part of the process, and that also means paying the people in the communities that you're trying to serve. And that's what we're not seeing. We're not seeing people taking the time to get to know the communities they're trying to serve, to pay the communities they're trying to serve, and then to try to actually be a part of it. And so if you're just picking up what's trending and you're like, oh, this is going to be great, this is going to go viral, this is going to be huge, but you're not taking the extra step to make sure you're doing it the right way, then you're still falling into that place where you will get called out for it, but also it does seem inauthentic. However, when you see people, wow, sorry, my acupressure ring that I love. But when you see people like Rihanna doing what she's doing, you realize the reaction is going to be what it is because it was authentic.
Right. That's a great response to evaluating the sincerity of the change that we're seeing. So if you go behind the scenes and you're beneath the surface and you're really looking at, did you consult with the community you're now speaking to? How are they part of your payroll? How are they part of your decision making? You know, for the average person to just see a person of color on the cover of the magazine, they might think it's, I mean, in many ways it's a win, but you know, who is making that decision and what do they look like? So that's a great response. I want to, Bradley, ask you a question, because in our most recent episode, you talked about how fashion can help people feel connected. So I know we're criticizing fashion, and it's often looked at through the lens of consumerism and capitalism, but this idea of connection. So you gave a great example of a person with a disability who, say, has limited mobility, but through products can feel part of a community and can feel a sense of identity. I'd love for you to elaborate and maybe draw upon your own experiences.
Sure. I came up in streetwear, you know, so that was always a thing. You can kind of travel around the world and you see somebody wearing a t-shirt or sneakers and you know that you're connected to these people in some certain way. It was like this global gang of people that like knew what was up. I think that in more recent years, now that social media has picked up on everything, it's allowing more people to access their kind of niche groups, right? And so by purchasing items, you are able to align with people that you feel comfortable with. I notice it most specifically in the world that I'm in because it's such kind of like a drop type of culture. These like different products like that allow people to join groups. And I think that there's something interesting to that. I was thinking back when I was first in the hospital, when I first got hurt, there was a lot of people kind of doing physical therapy together, but mostly young guys, because that's the kind of people that break their necks. But like everyone had 6 sneakers, you know, because that was like a thing that, you know, it kind of allowed you to stay connected to the world that you were missing out on, right? You're in a hospital for 6 months and you're just kind of trying to get through stuff, but it's like, oh, you know, getting the new foamposites or getting the new whatever was this way of identifying with the group that we were missing out on. So to me, that's kind of, you know, microcosm of how I view that identity through consumer culture, right? It can definitely be viewed negatively, you know, as kind of the evolution of capitalism and this bad thing, but in the same breath, it can allow people to feel a part of a group or feel connected to a group in a way through making purchases.
Yeah, I have to say that when I started working at Highsnobiety and became more involved with the street culture market, which is now really part of mainstream fashion, I noticed that industry was so much more inclusive. It's sort of like if you know, we're participating in like reading the same blogs and buying the same sneakers, you're in. Whereas in fashion, it felt more like you have to look a certain way. It just felt a lot more exclusive. So I think that's a really cool note specifically about streetwear and street culture. I want to shift the conversation over to intersectional identities. And Jody, you've learned a lot about intersectional identity through your work and through your personal journey. And I would love to get your thoughts on what is it like to be a person with an intersectional identity in America today? And then the follow-up to that is, what is fashion doing to support or not support people with intersectional identities?
Okay, so intersectionality. I think to ask what it's like to be to have intersectional identities is similar to asking what is it like to be human, right? We need to think of this as just a human experience with layers of lenses. I remember this great quote that James Baldwin says. He says, you know, the thing that white people don't understand about Black people is the very thing they don't understand about themselves. And so when we look at other folks and we say, like, what does this mean to be, you know, trans? What does that mean? Or what does it mean to be a Black woman? What you are asking is wherever you have a blind spot around yourself. So I can't quite tell you what intersectionality what it feels like to be a person with intersectional identities. The term, so I'll say that it's like being human, and then I'll back it up and take it back a bit. The term has been, I think, a little bit co-opted at this point, and it is used by everyone to mean, all of the ways in which you see yourself. But it was coined, the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a scholar, and it was really meant specifically about how Black women have this compounded issue. Their Blackness compounds everything, and it's stacked on top of, and it somewhat negates them, right? So even before Kimberly Crenshaw, there was a woman by the name of Sojourner Truth, who was a Black woman who was a slave, and she asked a really poignant question, and it was, ain't I a woman? And that means, does my Blackness, does my being a slave negate me being female? Do you see Black first and slave first, and does that take away my humanity? And so the question of intersectionality really is about colonialism and really is about racism. Like, I'm not intersectional. It's just the fact that racism has allowed for my race to supersede and compound everything. It becomes this super wicked problem that we are asking me to identify and deal with. And honestly, I didn't come up with the word, and I'll give you all the host bitch. I didn't come up with the word nigger. I didn't come up with the word trans, tranny, all the negative words. I didn't come up with them. Someone else did. And so the question I'll bounce back is, why did you need to come up with those words? Why did you need to come up with these filters that then make me have to describe over and over again my humanity? Yeah. So intersectionality is something we have to look at. I'm not even sure if people want to peel back all the layers. I mean, I have a son who's a Black transgender boy, and I find that to be hard for people to wrap their head around. I'm a Black woman who's lived hetero, and I'm in a queer relationship now. And people are like, well, what does that mean? I don't know, you figure it out.
Yeah, if only it were that simple, right? Nora and Ash, I'd love to share your experiences.
I love everything that you just said, because it's funny because coming up here, there's so many things to say, and like, even when you ask me like, what's my story? I'm like, I have so many things to say, and it's just like, because you're constantly, when you have to deal with your identity on such a level of like healing just to like walk out the door, I think that is the problem, is that like, the fashion industry is built off of a colonial system. It is from France and England. It is distributed from a colonial mindset, and it is started in the US from a classist system that's based off racism, that's based off supremacy, that's based off of, supremacy in all ways, of gender, of binary, of being included or not included, or of being a part of a conversation or not being a part of a conversation. And then I think women of color are constantly asked to do all the work, like they're constantly asked to explain to everyone else, what is racism and what does it feel like to do this? And it's like, what is, women or anybody within the, being a part of not the normal society privilege. It's like words. Yeah, and it's like, it's interesting because I have lived within both sides, and coming out took so much work and so much healing just to see myself in the mirror, just to be able to look at myself and be like, oh, that's me. Like, finally, I can just look at myself and just know that I don't have to perform anymore. And fashion is so much about performance. And so there's so many layers when it comes to this performance, this feeling of not belonging. And it's all built off of this system of colonialism and built off of racist, socialist, or classist structures. So
it's exhausting, right?
It's exhausting.
I'll give you a really quick example about intersectional identity and fashion. It's LOL, but it's not. So I travel quite a bit, and I'm usually traveling alone. And when I first started to, I was always profiled because I look Middle Eastern, right? So this is the even crazier part, is that my race is actually not Middle Eastern, it's my perceived race. So there's your actual race, and there's what people are perceiving you to be, and that's how you're gonna be treated. And of course, the stereotype of the Middle Eastern man is its own panel conversation. Obviously, I'm not supporting that. But that's how I would be treated. I'd be pulled aside. The security would scrutinize every item in my bag. I would be late for flights. I'd miss flights. It was humiliating. This one time, the security officer was inspecting my bag and found like old issues of Vogue that I travel with for like inspiration. And I think I had borrowed my sister's Dopp kit, and it was like a free Clinique butterfly pouch that I put my toiletries in. And he looked at me and rolled his eyes and turned to his colleague and was like, this was a waste of time. So it kind of clicked right there that I need to dial up the gay in order to have them see me as a gay man instead of my race. So moving forward, in order to avoid all of the humiliation and the waste of time, I would show up to the airport with like Vogue in my hand, Teen Vogue in my hand, and I would get to the customs agent, and before even showing them my passport, I would flock down the magazines and then show them my passport. And of course, they'd be like, oh, where are you coming from? Los Angeles. Oh, what were you doing? Oh, I was shopping, hanging out with my friends. Okay, cool, go. And it completely changed the dynamic. And it's so ridiculous, but it just goes to show you that those layers of identity and what they teach you and what they taught me about people's mentalities, because a gay man is not a threat. It's not a threat to the airport. It's not a threat to anyone's security, right? Because we're sissies, as that's what they think. And it's so ridiculous that that whole dynamic plays through. But that's just an example of intersectional identity and fashion.
It's so interesting that there's a hierarchy to these identities. And I'm not even sure, we talk about privilege and we wonder, all of us have some form of privilege, and you try to figure out what privilege do you have and how can you use it for good. But when you talked about that story, I had a similar story coming back from Jamaica. I was about to take a new job working in fashion for Zach Posen as director of PR. I had 3 days before my new job. So I thought, okay, I'll jump over to Jamaica for a weekend by myself, which I thought was quite like fabulous and fashionable and like great. And then I had a carry-on bag, some cut-off shorts, like a really cute scarf. I thought I looked great, right? And I was feeling great. And as I'm coming back from Jamaica to New York, they stop me. And they say, we know you're a drug carrier. And we know that you're working for such and such drug lord, and we're gonna need to they pull me aside, but they're still talking to me in front of everyone, humiliating me. We're gonna need you to do a urine test, no problem. We're gonna also do an internal exam. There's the problem, right? And they said, we know everything about you. And so they made me miss flight after flight after flight. They made me explain. And then at the last minute, they said, well, there's one flight left going to New York. We're going to handcuff you, put you on the plane. When you get off the plane, we'll handcuff. You'll be in your handcuffs, and the security will come and take you, which they did. And they interrogated me for a few more hours, insisting on me explaining my identity. And so the fashion, I was fashionable. I told them I was working in fashion. I had a business card. I had all kinds of credentials. I had bank account, everything. But they did not see it over my race.
Yet they couldn't see past it.
They couldn't see past it, and they ended up doing an internal.
Wow.
Yeah. Completely violation of all kinds of laws. So I don't know. I think, again, this idea of race is like the most wicked issue, the most wicked problem that the world is facing. It supersedes all of that shit.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at these layers. Yeah, I'm sorry that happened. So let's look forward. As in the future, it seems like we're at a point in culture where there is a major shift happening in terms of inclusivity and hopefully marginalized people being treated better, hopefully. Where do you see this going? Is it a linear trajectory? And if it is, what's that next layer of progress going to look like? Is it going to swing back? And then the follow-up to that is, how's fashion going to go along with that?
As an industry, you're asking? Which way are we swinging?
Yeah, as an industry, as a community that can actually help advance change.
I feel like this kind of ties into your earlier topic of like, is this a trend, right? If it's a trend, then great. because at least the trend can kind of crack walls, crack ceilings. And then when we come back to where we were, it's in a different place than it was before, right? So even if we are in a trend sort of cycle, it at least advances us forward so that way we don't come back to where we were. I think that we kind of follow the money, right? So people are buying stuff and we're supporting brands, we're supporting designers, supporting companies that are doing positive things. Those companies will flourish and they will, gain market share and continue to affect the way that behaviors move forward. It's somewhat idealistic to think in that way, but I think we are in a reality that's pushing the things forward, and it's pushing the way that people that own companies, that design products, create products, to think about more different groups of people. Also because you can access the different groups now as well, right? I don't see someone that looks like me wearing these clothes, but now there are companies that do exist. You do see people that look like you doing things, so you know where to spend your money. You're not forced to spend your money on a brand that, I only see 6 brands, nobody looks like me, I'll just pick the one that's close enough, You can find companies that do things that align to you, and I think that that's helping push it forward.
I think that it's not going to be a linear, I don't think anything is linear. I don't think it's a linear trajectory. I think it's going to happen with a ton more mistakes and need a lot more patience. But I do think that it would be naive to have this conversation and only talk about it through an outside perspective of like, okay, this is what we need the rest of the world to respond to. We need everybody to catch up to where we are, when the reality is within our own communities. If we are, and everybody up here is part of some type of sub-community or marginalized community, I think that it takes us internally within our communities knowing how to support one another and how to have each other's backs and how to show that support publicly and be there for this entire process. Because the reality is, I think a lot of the time we stifle our own progression. And this is at least from my own experience as a Muslim American woman. I think a lot of times we stifle our own progression because people care more about nitpicking about how you do something or how you push a message or how you choose to be a part of a campaign or participate in a panel or be a part of a brand. And the term for this is horizontal hostility, which I'm almost 100%, I actually am 100% sure I've mentioned on this very floor before at an event here, where you feel the sense of hostility and strangeness most with people within your own community because you expect people to live up to your expectations of how you practice your life. And so therefore it's harder for you to support people who share the same goals and values as you. And I think until we have that strength and that support within our own communities, it's hard for us to expect everybody else to catch up because we don't do it within our own selves. I recently interviewed Dapper Dan for a podcast, and we had this conversation because talking about his partnership with Gucci and how he gets a lot of flack for choosing to partner with Gucci when people want him supporting other brands instead or partnering with other brands. And his point that he said to me was, people within our own communities really need to start listening to the people who are in those rooms, who are at those decision-making tables, and actually hear them out and know that there is a way things work and that there is a way that you have to go about things to make things work. And so we have to be able to work together and hear each other out, because if you're so quick to cancel, if you're so quick to criticize, if you're so quick to put the people down who are in the arena, who are taking the action, who are doing the thing that is getting them I'm thinking of the Teddy Roosevelt quote, so I'm saying bloodied and marred, but not actually. If we're thinking about those people, then we need to protect them and uplift them so that they can continue doing the work and finding different ways to support them. Otherwise, it's ignorant for us to want to see change on our own terms when we have to realize we have a lot of healing to do as a community, as a nation, and individually. And until we're able to acknowledge that we all need healing and that we all need that sense of patience, we're really not going to get anywhere.
Yeah. Do we have a few minutes? Last question. what can people do just leaving tonight? What are some actionable things people can do to demand the change they want to see from the industry? You talked about money, which was great, is like so did you, be very conscious of where you're spending your money, right? So look beneath the surface. And are they practicing the sort of diversity and the sort of inclusion that you'd like to see, and being very smart about where you spend your money? What else can people do?
Well, I think it's interesting because there's a lot of like smaller brands or certain things that are happening, or grassroots movements, or people that you feel similarly connected to, and supporting them is a huge thing. And I think our money, again, is the main thing that we have the ability to make those changes. And I think it's a lot of times people feel powerless, but the only time you're powerless is when you give up your power. And I think right now you're kind of seeing within fashion, like it's always a reflection of politics. You said that earlier. And it actually feels like there's just not enough change happening. Like it still feels like it's kind of reflecting our political system where, there might be more representation, and there might be more people in power that, are representing marginalized communities, but it's still, the industry is still predominantly reflecting what our political system looks like. And I think it's just like whatever you feel that you have the connection to do and to change, make those actionable changes, and they could be in the way that the people that you support. But I think it's just realizing that it's awareness, and it's like your self-healing, and all of these things open up a lot more.
Yeah, just to educate yourself more politically. It's interesting because I wasn't a particularly political person up until a few years ago, and it's funny how I'm learning about politics through fashion. Fashion was really just a door for me to learn about politics.
I'd actually like to see companies and brands have pipelines to leadership. So I think campaigns are great. They give visibility. My family was in the Gap campaign, and we were in almost every window, and there was all this conversation around trans visibility. And that made my son and his friends and a lot of people feel seen. And then I would also like companies to have programs that allow for young Black trans kids and young queer kids to go through their companies and train up to leadership. Campaign is one thing, but then how are we actually addressing the millions of kids who are queer that aren't so cute in our eyes, or so digestible, and they're on the street? The kids that look awkward, the kids that would like a job, need a job, would do really well at a job, but just need training. So I'd like to see pipelines to leadership within our companies, and those can be large companies, small companies. But how do we train up kids that are seen typically as other to be leaders, not just to be not just to be in a campaign?
Yeah, it's not just about visual culture, it's about what's happening behind the scenes, the things that you don't see. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for your thoughts and for being here. Thank you to all of you for coming out. And a special thank you to NeueHouse for facilitating this important conversation. Yeah, thank you.